distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, our online audience as well, good evening, and welcome to this evening's book launch event for one of our recent IIS publications, the first Aga Khan, Memoirs of the 46th Ismaili Imam. It's a Persian edition and English translation of the Ibrat-afza of Muhammad Hasan al-Husseini, also known as Hasan Ali Shah, or Imam Hasan Ali Shah for the Ismailis here. So as I said, the format for this evening is that Dr. Beben will make a short presentation, and as will Dr. Daryoush Mohammadpour, and then it'll be followed by a short on-stage discussion, and then opening it up to questions from the floor. Daniel, if I could invite you to take the podium. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Salima, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to all of you for joining us here this evening. In my remarks this evening, I want to say a little bit about the significance of the book and the significance of the career of Imam Hasan Ali Shah within the broader scope of Nizari Ismaili history. And it's a very important period of history, and the book itself is particularly important, I think, for two reasons. Because I think it addresses what I see as two, we might say, incongruencies within the study of Nizari Ismaili history. The first of these is what I would term a chronological gap in our understanding of Ismaili history. If we look at a lot of the popular common presentations of Ismaili history, if you will, the sort of Wikipedia version of Nizari history, there's a very common narrative, of course, beginning with the lot of attention paid to the Fatimid era, of course, the period of Alamut, the early Nizari period. But then following the Mongol conquest, which culminated in 1256 with the destruction of Alamut, the murder of Imam Rukhnuddin Khorshah, the history of Nizari Ismailism moves into a very long and dark period. In fact, there's been relatively little research done on this intervening period, and remains quite obscure in many respects. And I think for many of us that remains the case until the time of Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, who is really seen, I think, in popular perceptions as very much the Imam who led the community through this great transformation, who really in many ways brought the Nizari Imamate back into public view in a way that had not been for a very long time. And this is certainly true in many respects. So there's no denying the very significant, transformative significance of Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah's imamate. But what I'd like to suggest here is that the very dramatic transformations we see that occur under Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, in fact, have a deeper precedent within Ismaili history. In many ways, dating back to the time of Imam Hasan Ali Shah, the first Aga Khan, who is, of course, the subject and the author of our book here this evening, but in some ways is building upon even longer history there as well. And this leads to my second point here, which is I think there's also an incongruency in our understanding of the multiple roles of the Imam, which we have seen particularly in evidence with the two most recent Imams, but with the earlier Imams as well, which is their role as politically and socially active figures on the one hand, and their spiritual role as Muslim leaders, as the Ismaili Imam. And again, in many popular perceptions, this is seen as a sort of tension between these two different roles. And I think if we look more closely at the career of Imam Hasan Ali Shah and at this text, helps us to better understand some of these incongruencies and how we might arrive at a more holistic understanding of these aspects within the history of the imamate. And what I would like to suggest here, the key factor that I think can really explain these various gaps in our understanding, is to really look at the role of the Imams, and of this Imam in particular, but earlier Imams as well, beyond the role as the Ismaili Imam, their broader role as social and political leaders within the Muslim world. And this means that we need to look at their role not only as Imams, but also as Sayyids, as descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. And in doing so, we need to keep in mind a very particular role that Sayyids have performed within Muslim societies, especially for the last several hundred years. As I was beginning my research on this book, one of the things that struck me is I was looking at some anthropological studies that have looked at more recent examinations of roles that Sayyids have played in various contexts. To give one example, back in the 1960s, there was a very famous American anthropologist named Ernest Gellner who conducted a study among the Berber tribes in Morocco. And one of the things he found is that within the areas of rural Morocco, where there was not a centralized state presence, there was not a centralized court system, there was often a lot of conflict that occurred between different tribal units within society. And again, in the absence of any sort of organized court system that could help to resolve these conflicts, there were certain individuals instead who played this kind of mediational role as a way of resolving these conflicts. And these individuals were Sayyids. They were considered to be members of saintly lineages. And again, because of their Sayyid genealogy, were considered to be sort of outsiders of the Berber tribal structure, and therefore were seen as more neutral mediators of conflict. And since that time, there's been a wide range of comparative studies done in places like Afghanistan, that have looked at similar phenomena that Sayyids have played as mediators of conflict. In the country where I live and work today, in Kazakhstan, there is historically a phenomenon of certain families who are known as Hojas, not the same Hojas probably many of you are familiar with, but rather a different group of Hojas, again, who have a Sayyid or an Alid lineage, and because of this lineage are able to historically have played this role of mediators of conflicts between different Kazakh tribes. So it's a very wide phenomenon we see historically within the Muslim world, and one that in many ways dates back to the time of the Mongol conquest. Now, we all know about, as I mentioned, the destruction of Alamut, the murder of the Imam in 1256. We also need to, at the hands of the Mongols, we also need to keep in mind the following year, 1257, was the conquest of Baghdad, and the Sunni Abbasid Caliph was also murdered by the Mongols. So in many ways, the Mongols were somewhat equal opportunity in their targeting of Muslim communities. But what this meant is that both for Ismailis, but for Sunnis and other communities as well, there was a sort of vacuum of leadership that opened, where many of the more central institutions within the Islamic world were destroyed, and instead leadership among Muslims started to devolve to a much more local level in a much more decentralized fashion. And it's really in the wake of the Mongol conquest that we see more and more Sayyids begin to adopt this very important role as oftentimes as intermediaries between local Muslim communities and the Mongols. The Mongols respected aristocracies, even as they were murdering or displacing certain elements of Muslim leadership. There were other aspects of more local leadership that were also patronized or given support by the Mongols. So we find many examples of Sayyids increasingly playing this important local role as political social leaders after the time of the Mongol conquest. And it's also a situation that gives a certain opportunity to the Nizari Imams, where their status as the Imam is threatened, is not something they're able to publicly reveal, but as Sayyids, they're able to claim a position of status and respect within society on that account. And this becomes particularly important after the Safavid conquest of Iran, which occurred in the early 16th century. As many of you know, the Safavids, of course, for the first time introduced Twelver Shi'ism as, we might say, the official religion of Iran. And an earlier generation of scholarship, for example, if we look at the work of Vladimir Ivanov, had worked under an assumption that because the Safavids had introduced Shi'ism as the official religion, that this would have been in favor of the Ismailis, as they would have found some more greater degree of protection. In fact, everything we have learned about the Safavids since that time, all the research that has been conducted, has showed actually quite the opposite. That in fact, the Nizari Imams were seen as an ideological threat to the Safavids, again, because they represent this living source of imamate. So we know that many of the Imams in the early Safavid period were persecuted. Imam Murad Mirza himself was actually executed by the Safavids. But we begin to see very interesting transformation that begins to occur towards the end of the 16th into the early 17th century, where the Imams seem to have reached some sort of an accommodation with the Safavids, and are able to draw upon their status as Sayyids, who are greatly respected by the Safavids, as a way of establishing a sort of political presence within Iran. They're, of course, not able to publicly acknowledge their imamate, but they are able to draw upon their Sayyid status. And we see the Imams emerging in the 17th and into the 18th century as local politicians, as local governors and mayors under the Safavids. And it's a situation which develops further into the 18th century with the decline of the Safavid Empire. Iran in the 1720s, 1730s goes into a state of crisis, a state of widespread political, social chaos within Iran. And it's within this environment that there is a Turkish warlord by the name of Nadir-afza, who rises to a position of leadership within Iran and is looking for new sources of support and legitimacy for his rule. And lacking the sort of genealogical support, the sort of religious support that the Safavids had, he's looking instead toward other sources of support. And one of the sources he finds is the Nizari Imams. So it's with Imam Abu Hasan Ali that we see this relationship that forms between the Afsharid dynasty and the Nizari Imams, which is around the same time that the Imams relocate to the Kerman region in southeastern Iran, where the Nizari Imamate becomes very much institutionalized within the Kerman region, and continue to play an important role under the Afsharids, under succeeding dynasties, as local governors, as political leaders within Kerman. And it is a relationship which continues under the Qajar regime, which comes into control in Iran at the end of the 18th century and continues throughout the 19th century. And it's a relationship that very much reaches its fruition with the figure of the first Aga Khan, of Imam Hasan Ali Shah, who, as you saw in the video there, of course, receives his title of the Aga Khan from the Qajars, is later appointed by Muhammad Shah Qajar as the governor of Kerman to the position that his ancestors had previously held. And again, we see evidence of this very key role that the Sayyid status of the Imams plays as a way of drawing upon this respect that they have among the political and social elite within Iran. And well, to make a long story short, there is a series of events that began about 2 years into the Imam's governorship of Kerman, beginning in the year 1838, which eventually leads to a protracted military conflict between him and the Qajar government. The details, of course, are covered at some length within the book itself. But one of the important things to note is, as the Imam is engaged in these military struggles with Qajar forces, as he's traveling throughout the Kerman region and then later into Afghanistan and Sindh and Baluchistan and these areas, as we find many examples within the book of how he is drawing upon these local connections, of the great respect that he and his family had obtained within local elements of society, which again really shows how deeply embedded the Nizari Imamate had become within the social fabric of these areas. And it's something that continued into his time in India as well, where within India, under the British, there is a tradition there of Sayyids serving as advocates on behalf of the Muslim community, the most famous example being Sayyid Ahmed Khan, the founder of Aligarh Muslim University. And we see a very similar role being adopted by the Imams there as well, as patrons of educational institutions, which again, in many ways leads the foundation for the later institutional developments we see under the Imams, Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah. So it's a very pivotal period for modern Nizari history, and I think in many ways, in fact, establishes the basis for modern Nizari history. And I think my colleague Daryoush is going to speak at some more length about the book itself. So thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. So I'll go straight to what I'm going to talk about here today. First of all, this book has got the title, The Memoirs of Aga Khan I. Now, it's somewhere between memoirs and autobiography, but the issue is a little bit more complicated, because when we look at this book, it's, first of all, it's a narrative, the first-person narrative of Aga Khan I. So it's him talking in the book. But the way it's originally published in the lithograph edition, and then later on the manuscript that we've got here, is that we see two other people. The first one is the one who is actually the person who's writing the words, and that's the name of the guy who's called Baghar Shirazi. He is the son of Basal Shirazi, and these are some of the people, the families of literary figures in the Qajar period. And he is the person who is commissioned by the Ismaili Imam to write these memoirs. And there's also a third person. The guy is called Safa. His name appears in the colophon of the manuscripts of the lithograph edition, and also in the manuscript which is available in the National Library in Tehran. Now, this third person, this Safa guy, is the one who's basically in charge of publication. They're running the lithograph things. He writes these things down. It's an equivalent of our Ivy Torres at the time of Aga Khan I, something like that. So you've got three people. This Safa guy you could eliminate. The Baghar guy is critical because the language of the memoirs, autobiography, runs through his tongue, and it shapes the way the text is formed. Of course, it is eventually the narrative which is approved, which is sanctioned, which is asked by the Ismaili Imam to be out there, because he checks this. You've got another text which is not here. It is a manuscript called Asar Muhammadi, which is produced at a later period when Aga Khan III is about 7 or 8 years through his imamate. This guy who is in the service of the family of the Ismaili Imams and actually claims in the manuscript, you'll find the manuscript there, it's on the left. He claims that he's been in the service of the family of Ismaili Imam since the time of Hasan Ali Shah, which is not exactly verifiable, but we could look back at generations, particularly the time when Nader Shah was the king and he had some kind of conflicts with Ismaili Imams. Now, in the text of this Asar Muhammadi, we find similar ideas. We find even exact reproduction of texts which are there in the Ibrat-afza. So it's an expansion of the same text. So it's interesting to compare these things. So there is this quote I've put here, which is from George Maqdisi's book on humanism. I'm not going to read the text for you, and the key argument of Maqdisi is that figures of power, and it applies to royal or figures, whether they are emirs, whether they are princes. I've got people of literary capacity around them, which makes it possible for them to communicate with the people around them. So in one sense, the role that this Baghar Shirazi is playing is falling in the context of this literary humanism, which is a very old tradition among Muslim rulers, and it applies to the Ismaili Imams as well. And we've got other examples of this even in our times. It's not the place to go into the details of it. Now, the colophons that you see here is basically referring to the original lithograph edition of the Ibrat-afza, which is the current book we've edited. You would see that on the right it is talking about another book, because when Aga Khan I is commissioning Baghar Shirazi to write the biography or the memoirs, it's not just that memoirs. He's commissioning him to write another thing as well, and he's producing a masnavi, a poetry, a collection of poems, and the name of that one is Bahram va Behruz. So if you look at the lithograph edition, the first bit which appears in the lithograph edition is this masnavi, is this poetry, which is dedicated to the Ismaili Imam. And then the actual book that we have edited here shows up. There is another text which is after that one, which is the third piece. So it's a collection of not just the Ibrat-afza, it's other texts as well, and they are printed all together. And it sort of goes into oblivion, because even if today, if you look around yourself, many of the people in the community, with the exception of probably Iranian people, wouldn't know that the Ismaili Imam even had a biography or memoirs like that. So it sort of gets forgotten, because it disappears. Now, this is the colophon where the Ibrat-afza, actually the actual memoirs begins. Now, the interesting thing about the colophons is that you find here the name of this guy, this Safa guy, and also, if you go back, to this place, it shows the name of the composer of the poetry, and this is the guy who's very central in producing the text the way it shows up. The colophon that you've got here is the one on the left. On the right is the opening of the Ibrat-afza, and the one which is on the left is the text which immediately follows the text of the memoirs of the Aga Khan there, which is again pointing to the fact that we're not dealing with only one text, with more than one text here. Now, there are a couple of points that I would like to cover here, which is basically a textual analysis of it and putting it in the broader context, historical, social, and political context of how the text is produced. The first one, of course, is the genre of the book and the way poetry is used in producing this, and the kind of poets which are used here. The second one is the issue of dual identity. Dual identity in the sense that for a number of centuries, after the Mongol invasion, up until the time of probably Aga Khan III, Ismailis have been actively engaged with the practice of taqiyya, which is hiding, concealing their identity as Ismailis. And this gradually over centuries became kind of a second identity for Ismailis. And it took until the time of Aga Khan III when it was gradually driven into the shadows. Up until the time when this book is written, this dual identity is quite powerful and very strong. Now, the third one is the personal and intimate narrative of the Aga Khan, which I'm going to speak a little bit at length here. And then there are sporadic Sufi remarks throughout the book. It's not a consistent one. There are a number of cases where it just shows up on the radar. So if you look at the genre of it, the genre of the book is particularly the kind of literary style which is dominant in the Qajar period at that time. And the thing around it is that the text is sometimes very convoluted. It's not really easy to figure it out, which is quite evident if you look at the translation of how we've produced it. It's not an easy task to figure out what the sentence actually means, because you see a lot of literary devices and ornaments, and to the point of really being very excessive even in the text, and it makes it very difficult to figure it out. And then we get to the choice of the verses here. Given here the list of all the poets which are used in the text, if you look at the fourth line, you see the major, sorry, I moved forward. The major poets, of course, Rumi, Hafiz, Ferdowsi, Attar, Saadi, and the people who are known to the Iranians are not exactly the ones who are frequently quoted. The one on top is Hasan Ali Shah. If you look at the date of his death, this poet is someone who is very close to the time of Vesal Shirazi himself, the father of the one who produced, who was commissioned to write this book. He frequently quotes this guy. It's quite evident that there is very close family, personal connections with him, and they are very much under the influence of this kind of poetry, and you see many cases of that. The rest of the people are just very scarce, only one or two instances where they are quoted. Now, that poem which is there, it's a verse by Yarmoy Jandari, and it's one of my favorite poems. It says, Orang Zamin Dagh Negin Bi Kolahi Taj Jam Rashk Barat Hishmat Shahane Imara. For a number of years, I didn't know who the poet was, and I asked one of my friends to produce his artwork based on this poem. This was done maybe about 22 or 3 years ago. I didn't know who the poet was. I'd read it in the actual book here. So, going back to dual identity, this idea of taqiyya was so dominant that if you read the text, it's not exactly easy to figure out whether these guys are Ismailis or Sufi Ne'matullahi people or Asnashiris. It's not very clear. This is one of the things that Daniel also alluded to. So in this text, there is a reference to the Fatimids and the Safavid rulers. And the claim which is there, of course, there are two versions. In the version that we've edited, you could see the footnotes there. The Aga Khan claims, or the one who writes the book, who's commissioned to produce it, claims that this Shi'i faith was not created or was not propagated by Shah Ismail Safavi. It was us, our ancestors, who originally introduced it. So it's not very clear whether he's referring to Ismailism or he's talking about Ismaili, Isnashiri, something which are pretty much two sides of the same coin. It's not very clear. And this becomes more evident in the manuscript of the Asar Muhammadi, which is pointing to the idea that there were many people around the Ismaili Imam, not Ismailis, people who were the Ismailis that we know today, who respected the Imam as a descendant of the Prophet, and also found him to be the flag bearer or somebody who protects the Shi'i faith. And this Shi'i faith, to them, was the Isna Ashari faith influenced by the Ne'matullahi Sufi order. So for them, the faith, the correct, legitimate faith, is the Isna Ashari faith. And you would see that in one of the pages which are open in the Athar Muhammadi. The same idea is reproduced here. It's because you could see the remnants of Taqiyya very dominant, very powerfully displayed here. So it lasts until the time of Aga Khan III. When we get to the idea of personal narrative, if you read the text, you would see that with the memories of the childhood of the Aga Khan and the way he is going through the difficulties of life that he has experienced, you would see the voice of a human being who is experiencing normal joys, sorrows, pains, frustrations of an ordinary human being. So in this sense, if you look at the book, it's not a doctrinal book. It's not a book of miracles. There are books which are produced about the life of the Aga Khans, and they look like Book of Miracles. In particular, the book which is titled Hidayatul Talibin, which is kind of attributed to Fadai Khurasani, is replete with these narratives that the Imam performed these miracles. If you read this book, there is no such thing like it. It very clearly puts the Imam within your reach as a human being that you could experience it. This is the human element of the book, which is very, very palpable when you read the book. Now, the last point that I would like to talk about is the idea of a Sufi content. Now, the text is not really relying on Sufi ideas, but it's quite evident that there is a filter here of somebody who is under the influence of Sufi Ni'matullahi ideas of a kind of mysticism which is peculiarly related and connected with the history of the development of the Ni'matullahi order. The contrast that I would like to draw here is that the Ni'matullahi Sufism, which is under the influence of Ibn al-Arabi, is quite starkly different and from the kind of mysticism of the Sufis of Khurasan, people like Abu Sa'id Abul Khair, people like Abu Hasan Kharagani, Attar, even Rumi. These people are coming from a completely different background, a different branch of Sufism, which is kind of understudied, because particularly in the West, people encounter this Ibn Arabi figure and consider him as to be the greatest figure of mysticism, which is not exactly historically accurate, but this was a later development, a post-Mongol development, which is kind of problematic. So that I've given the page numbers here. These are just very rare instances that you see the appearance of Sufi ideas. And you could see that there is an incident, a narrative is being being discussed here, and then somewhere the author goes off on a tangent and says something which is convoluted, and you could see it. It's really difficult to figure out what the guy is talking about. So who are we dealing with? Are we dealing with Vaghar Shirazi? Are we dealing with the Ismaili Imam? I think it's a mixture of both of them. We should not forget that the Aga Khan was extremely close to the Ni'matullahi Sufi peers and the entire order itself, and of course they were exchanging ideas, and you could even see the same influence in the literary style, in the language of Aga Khan III, because he was basically an Iranian, his mother was Iranian, he was also Qajar prince as well, and the kind of training that he had was giving the same ideas in it. If you look at the ta'liqas that Aga Khan III wrote and sent to places like Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, you could see exactly the same kind of language. Every now and then you see some hint at some kind of a Sufi idea here. So that's it. Thank you very much.
So thank you both for really very fascinating presentations which have really clarified the book for me in many ways. I thought we could begin with a couple of questions before we open it out to the audience. Daniel, you discussed in your presentation the sort of the different role, or the spiritual and the political role of the Imam, and that's something that really struck me in reading the book, is really how political it is and how sort of secular it is. There aren't very many references at all to his sort of spiritual being. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. How significant then would you say this book is for a wider Ismaili literature? And who is the audience then for the book if he is not writing as a sort of imam to his community?
Sure. No, thank you. That's a very good question. And I think this matter of audience is key, as you mentioned. My sense from working with the book is that it was not written predominantly with an Ismaili audience in mind. It seems to be very clearly geared towards members of the Iranian elite. And it was written at a time, it's important to keep in mind, when he was actively trying to return to Iran. And in some ways the book shows the Imam trying to present an account of his actions, trying to defend himself against accusations of treachery against the Qajar court. So in a way it's written as a sort of apologetic piece and as a sort of legal defense in a way, and in support of his return to Iran. But it also, I think that's important for understanding the way he is referring to his spiritual authority within the text is very much through genealogy. And I think the passage that Daryoush highlighted is very key here, where even throughout the book he's paying great respect to the Qajars, to other previous Iranian dynasties. But there's also this little point where he kind of needles them a little bit and reminds the leader that, everyone thinks it was the Safavids in the 16th century who really gave political life to Shiism. Actually, it was my ancestors in Egypt back in the 10th century who got there first. So it's very much through this evocation of genealogy, of his Sayyid status, and I think in a way, again, that's really intended to appeal to a broader Shi'i audience. Yeah. And we see this even with his arrival in India after he has exited from Iran. One of the things he does every year is he provides financial patronage to the Muharram commemorations for the 12 communities in all the cities where he lives. So in Jamnagar and Calcutta and Bombay and all these places, he provides support to 12 Shi'i institutions. While he's also, of course, being very open about his status as the Imam. So I think it's part of what you were referring to, this broader support of Shi'ism as an idea.
Yeah, no, that's really very interesting, because we see then the Imam as, as Ismailis we see him as our Imam, but then historically, if you consider him as came out in Daryoush's presentation, one among many leaders within a broader Muslim cohort, if you want. So this really brings me to the next question to Daryoush. Is we have the manuscript you referred to here, the Athari Muhammadi. Given the sort of discussion about audience, how would you then compare this book and these two manuscripts?
Well, basically this Athar Muhammadi is a kind of an extended version. It's not just about Aga Khan I, it's about Aga Khan I, the second, and also Aga Khan III. The author is basically the same kind of author as you find in the Ibrat-afza. But this person is giving such extensive details about the life of all these people, and the kind of examples that he gives is quite clear that this guy was eyewitness. He was an insider inside the Imamate family. And of course he makes a distinction between these people around, which is the retinue of the Imam, the people who are in the service of the Imamate family, as people who are his loyal followers, and Ismailis. He refers to Ismailis as a separate category. He calls them Jama'at Marade. He calls this is a plural of murids. One of the interesting things in the Athar Muhammadi, which is a kind of an extended narrative of the Ibrat-afza, because it runs after the time of Aga Khan I, is one of the things that he mentions about Hasan Ali Shah talking to his daughter, who was married to Aga Khan I. So it's not found in any other manuscripts. It's not even in the Ibrat-afza. That the king, the monarch, is telling his daughter that I have done you a great service. So in this world and in the hereafter, even I will reach salvation through the descendants of this man. Because at that time Aga Khan II was also born. He was the grandson of the king. So it's both ways, what you're saying. So it's not just the Aga Khan reminding the Qajar king that I came before the Safavid king, but also the view of Hasan Ali Shah, at least, because the later descendants came into different kinds of conflicts, that he deeply respected the Aga Khan, not just as his son-in-law, but also as a descendant of the Prophet's family, who is clinging to the authority of the Ismaili Imam for his salvation in the hereafter. He was a devoted believer, of course. He was a Sufi figure too.
Okay, that's very interesting. If we can just change tack slightly now. In you also, Daniel, in the book you refer to, you indicate that the role of the Imam shifts quite significantly in the move to India, and in your presentation you say that this marks the beginning of sort of the modernity of the Imamate. I was wondering if you could just sort of expand a bit on that, both of you.
Sure. Well, I think we see this in a number of respects. I mean, perhaps the most obvious one is with the shift to India, any formal political role for the Imamate thereafter ends. I mean, the Imams in many ways, even today, still remain very socially active and we might say politically engaged in many ways. But in terms of wielding formal political power, this is something that comes to an end with the departure of the Imamate from Iran. I think it also, with the shift to India, it means also a shift to what was then becoming part of the British Empire. And it means an encounter not only with the British colonial state, but also with new technologies, things like the printing press, for example, which, interesting enough, the printing press, it was actually developed in colonial states first, in India and in Russia, and only somewhat later came to other areas of the Islamic world. And this is something that is put to great use by the Imams, things like railroads, steamships, that allow the Imam to stay in contact with Ismaili communities in very far-flung areas of the world. So it's very transformative in a number of ways, and allows the Imams to begin a sort of process of centralization, of institutional transformation, that I think really reaches its fruition under the most recent Imams, but in many ways begins with Imam Hasan Ali Shah within India.
So he really does mark then a transition from a much earlier kind of political world, both in Iran, but also in terms of the kinds of authority that he wields within, Persia, and then sort of finding a new way forward within kind of the colonial world, with its technological changes. I mean, he really is a kind of pivotal figure then in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see, the point that I would like to add to this is that if you look at Aga Khan first of all, he doesn't really give up on the hope of returning to Iran. He considers himself somebody in exile.
Yeah.
He always wants to go back. And this is pretty much evident even in the text of Asar Muhammadi, where the author says that I was in the presence of Nizari Shah, the second monarch after Fatih Ali Shah, and I was trying to explain to them that there is no ill will on the side of the Aga Khan, and you've misread the whole situation. So the idea is that he wants to go back. But the idea of modernity is something which doesn't really come to fruition until the time of Aga Khan III, because yes, it's significant in the sense that it lands the entire Ismaili community and the Ismaili Imamate in a completely different new setting, which of course gives it the tools, the kind of vehicles it requires to institutionally change the circumstances of the community. But what we should not forget is that this is the behavior, this is the lifestyle, this is the mentality of the first two Aga Khan, who are basically Qajar princes. And up until the end of their lives, even at the time of Aga Khan III, you would see that they continuously invoke the idea that we are connected to this family of the rulers. Incidentally, there's a piece, this is the political side of it. It's not mentioned in the Ibrat-afza, but it's also it's in the Asar Muhammadi, where the Imam is basically saying that, look, the Qajar monarchy at this moment, they're going to rule for quite a long time. And his prediction is accurate because it lasts a very long time. So anybody who's trying to grapple with them or have any kind of battle with them, no matter whether there was any kind of fight with them, is going to lose. So he says, I'm not going to get myself involved in this kind of confrontation, which he left it eventually, and he left Iran because it couldn't work out. He couldn't come to any kind of arrangement or agreement between the two sides. As such.
Thank you. All right, I'm sure we have lots of burning questions from the audience, but before we open it out, I'd like to ask one final question, which has to do with something that both of you have raised, is his relationship with the British. And I found that interesting and sort of curious, because how do you explain his desire really to sort of cozy up to the British when he has other important Muslim rulers in the region, whose offers of support he rejects. How do we explain that?
Well, I think there's a couple points I would make. So one of the features of a lot of earlier scholarship on the first Aga Khan has really highlighted this relationship with the British, almost to the point of essentially accusing the Imam of being a British agent of sorts. And I think this is a very one-sided view of it. First of all, if we look closely at his memoirs, at other evidence, this is there's no evidence that this was a sort of long-term plan on the part of the Imam to seek this relationship. It was something that sort of emerged as an opportunity of convenience in a very critical moment in the Imam's career. And it's also important to keep in mind, this relationship was formed at a time when the British were at one of the lowest points in their colonial history, namely when they were almost down to the last man.
Losing in Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan, exactly. So it was not exactly a moment when, British colonial power was in its finest hour, if you will. And I think it's also, the Imam, in a lot of ways, he uses this term, the Haqqullah, the people of God, repeatedly. And some people have tried to claim that he's using this term solely in reference to the British, that he sees some sort of divine sanction behind British authority. But in fact, he uses in the memoirs in other contexts as well. And my reading of this is when he uses this term, when he more broadly evokes his authority as a Sayyid, is a way, again, of mediating on behalf of the Muslim community. And we see this in many cases in some of the more controversial aspects of the Imam's career during Charles Napier's conquest of Sindh, where he comes to support the British. And he openly addresses this in his book, that he acknowledges that the British are going to win, and it's better for the Muslim community to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, and instead rather to work with the British on behalf of Muslim interests. So this is the way he legitimizes that engagement.
The point that Daniel mentioned is that some of the commentators on the text of the Ibrat-afza have picked on this term Khalqullah, the people of God, misinterpreting it, misreading it, and portray it like a conspiracy theory, that the Aga Khan was referring to the British as the chosen people of God, which is entirely ridiculous, because people don't read the text. In other cases, this is a common phrase in Persian, of course. Khalqullah means the people, ordinary people, the folks, that's it. So the people who want to misinterpret it, of course, they put these words into the mouth of the Aga Khan. Yes, he was on their side in a particular case, in a situation where he had to make a choice. One of the things that we must not forget is that if the Aga Khan had just fled the Qajar Iran, with the conflicts that were around him and with all the intrigues in the Qajar court, he was fighting with them. He goes to Afghanistan, and the Baluchis and the Afghans there are also fighting with him. He's going to get into another fight with the colonials as well, because he wants to prove that I'm independent. What would be left of the guy? Forget about the imamate in the community. It would be absolute and utter destruction. People just don't look at it in rational terms. I think it's a matter of expediency, of prudence, of choosing what to do now, up until the next moment of choice that he's going to make. And you would see how he's maneuvering around the choices that he's got.
All right, thank you all for your attention. Can we thank our authors and our